Hello and welcome to FYC Conversations, a bit of a deviation from what you might be used to as far as our regular For Your Consideration programming, where normally we talk about the movies and the greatest films of all time and the movies that you shouldn't bother watching and the soundtracks of those movies. We've decided to introduce a new show which is basically conversations with people who work within the industry on these movies that we are talking about on the show. And now for our first guest on this inaugural episode of FYC Conversations, we have Alan Dean Foster. And for those of you who don't know, Alan Dean Foster is a prolific writer of fantasy and science fiction, and he's been crafting his stories professionally for the better part of the last 50 years. His first published novel, The Tar I'm Krang, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, was released in 1972, and it's a science fiction tale that introduced two of his most popular recurring characters, Pip and Flinks, whom Foster still writes about to this day. Since then, he's dabbled in pretty much every genre of fiction and non-fiction. He also wrote the script that would eventually become the first Star Trek motion picture. And he has also become very well known for his novelizations of many popular films. To my generation of reader, he was probably best known for his adaptations of the Star Trek animated series episodes in the Star Trek Logs series, and also for his work on the adaptations of the original 1977 Star Wars and the first three Alien film novelizations. Now, Alan's also done many other films. He's done Clash of the Titans, he's done Terminator, he's done Transformers, he's done Star Trek. I'm pretty sure there's even a Western in there. I think he might have done Pale Rider. So he's kind of all over the map. But for any film fan who grew up without DVD or home video or Netflix, you know what I'm talking about. These novelizations, they were the way that we got the deleted scenes. They were the way that we got into the characters' heads. They were the way that we had the movie at home. Once we'd seen the movie in the theater and it had left the theater, if you wanted to revisit any of those stories, you either had your scholastic storybooks, or you had your novelizations, or you had the story on record or tape where you played it and it would beep for you to turn the page. So these were like invaluable sources of entertainment and information for my generation of cinema goer. Now, Foster has recently returned to the Alien universe with his latest treatment of the Alien Covenant script into novel form, as well as a companion novel, which is an original story featuring the crew of the Covenant film entitled Alien Covenant Origins, which should be hitting bookstores at the same time this podcast is going live. The following interview is the first part of a conversation I had with Alan a few weeks ago about his work, and I should qualify that despite an extensive and fascinating body of work, we are focusing primarily on his novelizations as we are a film podcast, so we're just trying to stay on theme. If you're interested, I would genuinely recommend you go check out his other original work as well as the novelizations. There's some really good stuff there, and I'm sure you'll enjoy it. So I'm going to pass you on to the conversation with myself and Alan, and I will rejoin you on the other side. Enjoy. So I'm sitting here with prolific novelist and, for our purposes, novelizationist Alan Dean Foster. Alan, thanks so much for joining us.
Pleasure.
So I wanted to start to talk about your most recent novelization for Alien Covenant, talk a little bit about your process, some of your other novelizations that you've done, and then talk a bit about Origins and maybe some other stuff you've got coming up.
You go right ahead.
So jumping into Covenant, your latest novelization, I felt that was an interesting return to form for you, as you had written the first three novelizations back in the day. Was the idea to bring you back into the fold on Fox's initiative?
I'm not sure exactly who said let's do this. I do know that Steve Saff, who I've known for many, many years from his time as an editor at Del Rey and now editor at Books, asked if I would be interested in doing it. I'm sure, as is always the case in these situations, that he had to get pre-approval from Fox before asking me if I would be interested in doing it. So that's probably the way it worked.
I know I was genuinely excited to read your opening line for this one, as I remember the variations on the Dreamer motif for the first three books. So firstly, thank you for that, because it was great returning to that with a bit of a twist on it. And I should also point out that despite the fact that it's been 25 years since your Alien 3 book, the language and the style, it felt very much the same as well. What was it like coming back to the franchise? And did you have to go back and refresh since those were written so long ago, or did you just jump into Covenant cold?
No, stuff tends to stick with me, and I have a decent memory. And it was very, very much like I just finished the first 3 books yesterday. There was no break for me mentally in going into Alien Covenant. It was just a continuation of what I'd done before. As far as the Dreamers opening, whenever something like this happens, whether the books are 2 months apart or 25 years apart, I think it's great for the fans to see some kind of continuity in the style and in the way the books are approached. It makes it feel like one continuous saga, which is what fans of any series really are looking for. The fact that a lot of time elapsed between 3 and Covenant shouldn't matter when you're reading a series. They should all read in a steady, continuous flow. If the style remains the same, that's just because my style and my language hasn't changed.
So do you have that same kind of muscle memory with any franchise, or is there something particular about the Alien franchise for you?
No, it seems to hold true across any franchise that I work with, whether it's Star Trek or Star Wars or Alien. If somebody asked me to do another Clash of the Titans book, if somebody came out with Clash of the Titans 2 tomorrow, it would probably be the same thing. I would go back and take a very casual scan of the first book just to make sure that I didn't misplace gods and goddesses, for example, and just go into it. Everything stays in one, it's one continuous river.
Now, this might be an unwieldy question to ask, but can you describe the process of doing a novelization from you getting the first script to having the publisher giving their final thumbs up? Like, what kind of pitfalls do you encounter with content and working parallel to a film's production?
Actually, it's perfectly wieldy. I get the script first, and I read the screenplay, and then I beg and plead with the studio for any kind of supplementary materials that they can provide, particularly in the way of visuals, whether they're still photographs from the set or from the special effects that are in progress. And if I can't get those, or even if I can get those, any pre-production drawings, sketches, anything visual that I can incorporate into the book so that somebody reading the book, when they're reading about somebody's spacesuit, the spacesuit in the book is described the way it actually appears in the film. It's very disconcerting for the reader of a novelization to constantly bump up against things in a book that don't accord with what are in the film. So I always try to do that. On very, very rare occasions, it's only actually happened a couple of times, I'll actually get to see some, if not all, of the film before it's released, which of course is a great help in making sure that that sort of continuity between the book and the film occurs. And I'll put the screenplay on one side of my computer, and I'll have my open manuscript on the other side. The fact that computer screens have gotten larger and larger has been a great help because my eyesight has gotten weaker and weaker. And I'll read the screenplay, and then I'll take a piece of it and I'll put it into prose form and add what I can add and develop what I can develop. And it goes on that way until I run out of screenplay pages. But while I'm doing that, I'll, of course, refer back to those visual add-ons that have been provided to me by the studio so that I can make sure that what's in the book looks like what's in the film.
Has the quality of the production materials or availability of the production materials improved over the years as interest in film has kind of increased, or has it pretty much been the same all along?
No, it's improved a great deal, and this has nothing to do with the difference in filmmaking or in the films themselves over the last 45 years. It has to do with the ability to deliver those materials in a swift and secure manner that didn't exist decades ago. Back when I started doing novelizations, if somebody wanted to send me something in addition to the screenplay, it had to come in an envelope via a delivery service to my house. It was slow, and the security, needless to say, was not what the studio certainly would have liked. So they had a tendency to hold back from putting something in the mail for fear that it might get opened and distributed, even though distribution was also limited by the lack of technological ability to do so. Nowadays, it's a kind of a contradiction. Even though the ability to disseminate such material, it is intercepted and stolen, and posted worldwide overnight is infinitely greater, so is the security. For example, when I was doing a novelization of Star Trek Into Darkness, the studio was able to send me the entire film in pieces. not all at once, for security purposes, over the internet via a security system that would make the NSA proud. So in addition to looking at the screenplay on the left side of my screen, I could occasionally bring up pieces of the actual film. It was quite an experience after doing this for such a long time to be able to sit there and fast forward or reverse fast forward or freeze a frame and study it before I actually wrote about it. It worked out very well, and as anybody can attest, the security system works very well too.
So I can understand the, what's the word I'm looking for? The benefits of having, the actual film to kind of look at while you're doing the work, just to get the visuals and everything kind of synced up with between the book and the film. Do you feel that there's possibly a danger in having that where maybe your imagination wouldn't take something, push it just that little extra bit to sort of describe things the way you maybe had in the past, to be a little more didactic about it?
No, I don't think that's a problem. Again, as I said before, I really take pains to make sure that what's in the book accords as closely as possible with what's in the film. That still gives me a lot of leeway in developing those things that are either not in the film or not expanded upon in the film, such as showing a character's thoughts and motivations, which you can't really do, you don't really have time for in a 2-hour film, and other parts, for example, shots of the neomorph in Alien Covenant, which you don't get as much of in the film as I did in the screenplay. I had a pretty good idea what it looked like. I saw pre-production stuff and production stuff. But I was still able, for example, to describe certain ways it moved and its own motivations. So I don't think that's really a problem. I have plenty of room to expand without having to, while still being able to make everything read in the book exactly as it appears in the film. Again, the studio is always a check on this sort of thing. If I were to do something in the book that went against something obviously that appeared in the film, the studio would catch it and say, you can't do that because, well, it's not in the film, or it's not the way it works in the film. The trigger on the gun is here and not here. You've got to put it back where it goes. So there's always somebody looking at what you're doing. In the old days, nobody did that. The studio didn't care as much. Novelization was just an ancillary right. And if you wanted to mess around with what was in the film a little bit more, nobody cared so much. Nowadays, everybody has, particularly with franchise films, has committees that review everything, or individuals that review everything. And anything the studio doesn't like, you can argue for. But in the end, it's a work for hire, and what the studio says goes.
Is there anything different in the process when you're dealing with, you were talking about, it's a little bit different with franchise films. Some of those franchises already have established book universes, I guess. Like there's tons of Star Trek novels and Star Wars novels and Alien novels. Whereas with something like, you mentioned Clash of the Titans, there isn't already that established expanded universe. Do you find dealing with the studios any different when you have those two situations?
Less so today, but still there's a certain amount of extra freedom that's involved. When a studio puts out a film that they think is just going to be a one-shot, they don't really care, for obvious reasons, if you develop things a little bit more or take things in a different direction, because it's not part of the film process. Again, it's an ancillary right, and generally they just don't care. What's interesting is when they take an older film and might consider developing it into a franchise, and then they'll get back on you. Let's take The Last Starfighter, for an example. That was a one-shot film. There are no sequels. It's been out for a long time. There have been a lot of talk over the last few years of doing a remake, and I assure you, if the remake occurs, the studio will also put people in place to review everything with an eye towards possible sequels. But generally, when a film is just a one-shot, the studio cares less because they have reason to care less.
Has your process changed at all over the years, or do you approach them all basically the same way every time? I mean, obviously there's the technological differences that you've already described, but the way that you look at a script and tackle a script, have you changed any of that over the years, or is it basically the same way you get into it?
No, it's exactly the same as it was with the very first one. The only difference is that I'm more confident now that I'm going to be able to get a full novel out of the screenplay because I've done it so many times. And otherwise, it's still a combination of a professional writer and an excited 14-year-old fan. And you put the two of them together, and you get, I hope, a combination of craftsmanship and enthusiasm that shows up in the final result.
Now, one of the big draws for novelizations for the movie fan in the past had always been, like you said, getting that interior world of the character, or deleted scenes that when the writer had the script, they were still in the script, but, through whatever post process, it got cut out. So when I read the Covenant script, or when I read the Covenant novelization, there was a couple of things that I was kind of hoping that you would get into a bit more that you didn't. So I just wanted to ask you those two questions now and see if they're not covered by an NDA or anything.
Sure, I'll let you know.
The first one is when the crew examines the Juggernaut. There's that whole lead-in where they're going up the ravine or whatever, and it's, the trees are cut off, and they conclude that the Juggernaut has crashed, and it's sitting there. But then the last time that we saw it was in flashback with David piloting it and dropping the ampules or whatever on the engineers gathered below. Was there something that we missed in between that docking process and the crashing process, or
no,
was that just something that was never touched on?
It was nothing that you missed. There was something that I missed. That whole sequence with David piloting the Juggernaut and doing the drop was not in the screenplay that I was given to novelize.
Okay.
Otherwise, it would be in the book.
So had that been there, you would have been compelled to sort of fill in that gap.
Anything that was in the script I was given ended up in the book.
All right. The explanation for the crash was never put in the film, so I thought maybe if it was in the script that it would have been something that you came across.
No. I see what you're saying. No, there was no explanation for the crash. They find the ship and they go inside, and that's it.
Fair enough. The last question for what possibly wasn't in the film but in the script. Daniels' first name. That's been bugging me since I first saw the film. I was hoping I'd get that in the novelization. In some of the supplemental materials, I've seen her listed as Dr. A. Daniels. Was that ever clarified?
No. If it was, again, minor point or major point, it doesn't matter. If it had been in the script, and it bugged me too. I wanted to give her a first name, at least in one line. Yeah. But it wasn't in the script.
Fair enough. So obviously, I mentioned previously one of the big attractions to a novelization was getting those deleted scenes. And clearly novelizations are still getting made. But do you think that DVD or home video has cut into the territory once held by film novelizations, being able to include all that supplemental material?
Without having a bunch of statistics at hand from publishers, it'd be difficult to say. But my personal reaction is I don't think so. I think when someone likes a film enough to buy the regular version of a film, the extended version of a film, they also, if they read, like to have the novelization. Not only because there's always some material, because it's the author's invention in the novelization that's not even in the extended cut or the director's cut, but just because they like to be completists about something that they really like. So no, I don't think that's cut into it. If anything is cut into the sale of novelizations, I don't think it's extended editions and director's cut versions of the film. I think it's just that there's so much material available on the web that's ancillary to these projects. For example, the interview you're doing right now, and discussion boards, that people get overwhelmed with material for a particular franchise or a particular film, and they can only handle so much. And that may have something to do, if it is the case, with any reduction in sales of novelizations. There's only so many hours in the day and only so much time that people can devote to their favorite pieces of entertainment.
Do you feel that in your experience, have you seen less novelization offers coming across your table, or has that not diminished for you at all?
It's been fairly consistent. I mean, I turn down... there are always people who come up with projects more frequently than you might imagine, who haven't gotten film made yet, but would love to see a novelization of the screenplay come out, obviously to help promote incipient film. And I have to turn down a lot of those, even though a lot of the screenplays are very good and very interesting. But that's just the nature of the film business. There are a lot of very interesting screenplays out there that just don't get made. So I turn down a lot of those. As far as real films that get made, not everything is suitable for novelization. Not everyone wants to do a novelization, and publishers have become a little more picky, I think, about what they're willing to invest time and money in as far as novelizations. If it's a major franchise, like those we've already mentioned, then sure, they like to have a novelization come out. But the distaff side of that coin is when you get a writer who wants to add to the story and wants to put more material in, which after all is really the only reason to buy a novelization, is to get more of what you already like, there's this problem of having the writer do something that might contradict something that the film studio wants to do in the future. Not something that's in the existing film that's out, but let's say you're talking about Alien 7, and we're not, but let's say that we were, and I, as a writer, wanted to put something in there about the history of the engineers, for example. That might not be approved, not because it's bad, not because it doesn't conform to all of the existing Alien stories, but because somebody might in the future want that particular bit of storyline reserved for whoever directs the film and writes the film. So it becomes this kind of preemptive elimination of material that you might like to put in.
Do you feel that the industry has changed much? I noticed with, for example, jumping back to the Star Wars novelization, I believe that came out like 6 months before the film.
That's right.
And with the latest Star Wars novelization, The Force Awakens, I think that came out like a month or over a month after the film.
With The Force Awakens, they were so concerned about people having material out before the film came out because of the ease of distributing everything on the web overnight, essentially, that they held back the novelization until the film essentially was out, so that plot points and details of the film could not be widely distributed before the film itself came out. With the original Star Wars, the very first film, that wasn't a concern because there was no World Wide Web and there was no essentially internet. And if people were going to steal copies of the screenplay or steal copies of the novelization in this case, then they could, it would take a long time and a lot of time and effort to distribute it. The reason the book version of Star Wars came out so far before the film did was to try and build interest in a film that nobody really knew anything about. It was a very wise decision by Charlie Lippincott, who was in charge of such things, and George Lucas to do that because people got interested in the book. And the book developed its own back talk, even though it didn't involve instant communication on the web. And by the time the film was released, there was a fair amount of interest in the film, in good part due to the fact that the book had been available for so long. Nowadays, that's not a problem.
So on your end, all that really does is maybe change where your deadline is?
No, the deadline is still yesterday. Everybody gets the manuscript yesterday because there still exists this unfortunate chronological dichotomy, and don't ask to say that 3 times in a row, between the studio and the public. The studio can edit the final film digitally these days, right up practically until the day of release. Previously, obviously, it had to be finished well in advance so that copies could be made on film stock and distributed to theaters. Publishers like to have a year between the time they receive the actual finished manuscript and the time they put the book out. The way our society has compacted time-wise, that just doesn't work anymore. But publishers, to get out a print book, still need a certain amount of lead time to proof the manuscript, get the manuscript set up to print the manuscript, get the cover made, bind the book, box the book, and ship it to bookstores. And meanwhile, studios are still editing the film in many cases, right up until just before the date of release. That's an example, by the way, of why something like the David piloting the Juggernaut scene is not in my book. That obviously was added after the screenplay was given to me.
You talked about just now, things changing and being edited sort of up to the last minute. My understanding with Star Trek Into Darkness is that there was a lot of stuff changing on that film as it was being filmed. I guess the same thing was happening on Alien 3, which that directly led to you not doing Alien Resurrection, did it not?
Yes, but it didn't have to do with the changes that were being made in the film. Star Trek Into Darkness was able to see a fairly close to release version of the film while I was working on the novelization. With Alien 3, the problem was, as many Alien fans know, that I was disappointed in the screenplay that I saw, and I did what I always try to do, which is expand on the characters so that the characters, all of the characters in Alien 3 in the original manuscript version, had motivations for why they were on this prison planet. They weren't just there to be alien chow. Why was this character condemned here? Why was that character condemned there? What did they think about being there? How did they relate to one another? And there were other things in the screenplay that bothered me terribly. There's a scene, if I remember correctly, where two of the characters are sitting on a small mountain of used batteries, trying to find batteries with enough juice in them to power their flashlights, as if, hundreds of years in the future, we're still going to be using D cells. And the fact that Hicks and Newt arrived dead was it was terrible. I've spoken about this at length in other places. And I tried to fix all of those things, but fix them in ways that would not contradict the plot of the film. For example, with Newt and Hicks, I had them arrived with their capsules damaged so that any attempt to open them would result in their deaths. But if they were left alone, then maybe they could be fixed later when a proper, life pod technician arrived. So they were still present alive, but they still didn't interfere in any way with the plot of the story. That also provided additional motivation for Ripley staying alive, fighting to stay alive. And there was a lot more like that. And I turned it in, and I was very pleased with the result. And the publisher got a letter back from Walter Hill, one of the producers, saying, no, you can't do this. The book has to accord exactly with the events in the film, and we think it'll make for a better book. So instead of arguing the point, because it's a work for hire, I'd take all of that stuff out that I had developed and invented and just go back and do a straight transcription of the screenplay. It was very depressing because there was no rationale for making me take out all of that stuff. It was just, can't do it, go back, do it the way it was written originally. In other words, paint the house puce instead of brown, we want it puce. And that's what I had to do. And then when I was offered Alien Resurrection, the novelization project, that's why I turned it down. I just didn't want to be involved with it anymore. I'm happy to say that working on Alien Covenant was a perfect delight, and everyone I had contact with at Fox was not only amenable but enthusiastic, and it makes for a much easier go when you're actually writing something. That's not to say that they approved everything I did or wanted to do, but there was always a reason if I had to take something out or change something or do something a different way.
So when you turn something down, are you turning it down just kind of cold based on the offer and whether you think it interests you? Or do you actually get to see a script and maybe you look at the script and then go, I don't know if this is for me?
I've always been able to tell, at least for my own self, or just from a description of the project, whether I would really be interested in doing it or not.
Fair enough.
And I've always proceeded on that basis, even before any kind of financial offer has been made.
And with that, we bring to a close the first part of my conversation with novelist Alan Dean Foster. We hope you're enjoying this new interview format and would love to hear what you have to say about it. You can send us your thoughts on any of our social media platforms. Like, share, join, and follow on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. If you get the show off of iTunes, rate and review us while you're there. We also have a blog at wordpress.com/FYC show, and we have a Patreon campaign to help grow and expand the show. We'd love your support. It would go to bringing you more quality program like this very interview here. Be sure to join us in a couple of days when I'll be posting part 2 of the interview, where we talk more about Alan's work novelizing many of your favorite films over the last 40 years and discuss his brand new book, Alien Covenant Origins, which is in stores as we speak. And if you're looking for more from Alan, you can check him out online at alandeanfoster.com. And on top of the Alien Covenant Origins book, he will be releasing a new Pip and Flinks novel called Strange Music, which comes out from Del Rey in November. Thanks for checking out this inaugural episode of FYC Conversations. We appreciate your support. Join us next time as we conclude our conversation with Alan Dean Foster. I'm Mike Jozic. Take care. And on top of the Alien Covenant Alien Covenant Oranges.